We begin today's program in the Philippine capital, Manila, where the ASEAN Summit is ongoing. Chinese Premier Li Keqiang has attended the ASEAN +3 Summit and the East Asia Summit. The 10+3 cooperation is the main channel for promoting a shared East Asian economy, and the East Asia Summit served as a forum for dialogue on broad strategic issues relevant to the region. Chinese Premier Li weighed in on the current regional economic and political situation. Before our discussion about the output of these meetings, let's take a look at this.
10+3. That involves the leaders of all 10 ASEAN countries, plus representatives from China, Japan, and South Korea. Premier Li Keqiang is calling for quicker negotiations in the China-Japan-South Korea Free Trade Agreement to advance the East Asia Economic Community and to integrate East and Southeast Asia's diverse economies into a single market.
We are still seeing a mixed picture of the world economic recovery. Deglobalization and protectionism are on the rise. Cross-border regional issues are emerging, and this has presented challenges to us. I hope that through this summit, we can build a consensus and send a positive signal that we firmly support regional integration and advance the East Asia Economic Community.
As the world's most dynamic and promising regions in terms of development, East Asia accounted for 44% of global economic growth last year. Premier Li said establishing an East Asia Economic Community is a strategic goal of the 10+3 cooperation and accords with the long-term and fundamental interests of the people in the region. Other leaders at the meeting have supported Li's proposal.
In 1999, we used the power of solidarity and overcame the financial crisis. Let us create a vision for the East Asian community of peace, prosperity, and progress. Let us overcome the complex challenges, including protectionist and self-centered approaches, aging, and climate change.
Premier Li also touched on the progress made on the South China Sea issue, saying negotiations over the Code of Conduct can now move forward after an agreement between China and ASEAN. He reiterated China's commitment to resolve disputes peacefully and with the parties directly involved.
And for more on the ASEAN Summit and the East Asia Summit, we are now joined in our Beijing studio Zhang Jianping, who is Director General with the Center for Regional Cooperation at the Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation. In Singapore, we are joined by Lim Tai Wei, who is Adjunct Research Fellow at National University of Singapore. Coming to Washington, D.C. studio and joining us now, we have Marc Mealy, Vice President of the Policy at the US-ASEAN Business Council. I want to welcome the three of you, gentlemen. First of all, Mr. Mealy, many are looking at President Trump's visit to Asia-Pacific region this time. Much has he achieved during the ASEAN Summit and also the East Asia Summit?
Well, I think by most of the accounts here in the Washington area, people are somewhat relieved that the trip seemed to have gone pretty smoothly with no major sort of, diplomatic breaks or occurrences. I think also, given the kind of uncertainty that has existed around sort of the direction of U.S. Economic policy globally and towards Asia, I think the President's various speeches have sent a very clear signal as to where the Trump administration is moving in terms of how it wants to engage Asia.
Yes, indeed. At the same time, Chinese also sent its own delegations. And of course, it is also headed by Chinese Premier Li Keqiang. And what has been the outcome so far for the Chinese side this year?
Yeah, I think that this year between China and ASEAN, we have achieved a lot. The most important thing that is the Belt and Road Initiative Forum, and all of those ASEAN 10 economies supporting China's initiative, and also have their own, planning strategy to connect with BRI. And the second big event that is COC. Code of Conduct, in South China Sea issues. So this is a fundamental, framework document between two sides. That means the next step we may explore further our, so-called agreement, document, and then that would be the foundation for, South China Sea issues.
Of course, there's also RCEP, which many of the ASEAN countries participating
of course, that's
as well.
thing.
Of course, at this point, we don't have the deadline yet people we know are working quite hard on this. Mr. Lim, in Singapore, how do you see, leaders coming from China, from the United States this time, all present? Eventually, how would you assess this year's ASEAN Summit and also East Asia meeting as well?
This is a very important summit because ASEAN has just reached 50 years old, so it's a milestone in terms of organizational goals. And the fact that there are so many top leaders that have come to this region, I think it reinforces the idea that ASEAN is very much a player in this region. And as you have heard, the top three Northeast Asian leaders, China, Japan, and South Korea, they all have a sort of a uniform framework in terms of chronology when it comes to cooperation. They all referred to the 1997 Asian financial crisis and how solidarity has helped.
Okay, and let's go to Mr. Mealy.
A point of reference.
Let's go to Mr. Mealy about this also once again. We see
I think
interesting cooperation this time.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry. But you see, President Trump, in his speech, he's talking about the ASEAN as an interesting and important platform. But that seems to go against his previous remarks about U.S. only interested in bilateral rather than multilateral, because ASEAN is a multilateral platform anyway. So how should we read this contradiction? Does that mean he is actually switching his position in a quite unnoticeable way?
I think the way that many thought leaders and maybe policymakers in Asia will interpret the president's comments will be in terms of the questions around security. There does seem to be a willingness to engage ASEAN at the regional level. I think the clarity, or maybe as you noted, a potential contradiction, is that I think there is a pretty good sense that when it comes to economic engagement, the preferred approach of this administration is to pursue sort of bilateral economic engagement.
Right.
So I think there is a difference, and I think that's where, again, policymakers in the region will have to understand sort of that diversity of preferred engagement efforts.
Mr. Zhang, what do you make of that? I mean, on the one hand, President Trump earlier during his campaign, when he comes into office, all about bilateral, nothing multilateral. He's even criticizing WTO earlier during his APEC CEO summit speech. And now going to the ASEAN summit, he talked about ASEAN as a very important platform. And the United States and ASEAN are also having newer agreements on trade. So is the U.S. really, particularly this administration, changing its position, Mr. Zhang?
A few days ago, I just had a meeting with the U.S. friends. I said that the U.S. has enough time, energy, and money to deal with so lot of bilateral agreements. But actually, both bilateral and multilateral free trade agreements will promote regional economic cooperation. The problem is that if you want to talk in more and more bilateral free trade agreements, that means you have to take a lot of time and money. So in this regard, multilateral and mega free trade agreement will be more efficient. So between the U.S. and ASEAN countries, some of them have bilateral free trade agreement, some of them still has not. So in the near future, I'm afraid that the Trump administration still will focusing on bilateral instead of multilateral.
Is, as a result of that, Mr. Mealy, the U.S. going to lose opportunity, or is it going to have better terms when it comes to trade? Because President Trump was talking about reciprocity and also fairness. Of course, it's up to interpretation as exactly what those two words mean.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think as this administration begins to articulate in a more detailed way how it is going to define fairness and reciprocity in trade, I think it's pretty evident that, again, America's leading trade partners will have to decide, again, for themselves if they also see opportunities to pursue bilateral agreements, or would they prefer, I think, what has probably been a more beneficial approach for economies in Asia, which has been multilateral and regional initiatives. It's pretty clear from the fact that the 11 nations that are part of the old TPP, but now CPTPP,
Yes.
to be able to reach an agreement to move forward with that process kind of signals that, at least for those 11 nations, there is a continued preference for more plurilateral trade liberalization efforts as opposed to bilateral efforts. And as you indicated earlier, depending upon how ASEAN and its +6 partners, including China, Japan, and South Korea, can move forward with the RCEP negotiations in 2018, I think that also may signal that many economies in Asia still have a preference for sort of multilateral or plurilateral arrangements as opposed to bilateral arrangements.
Mr. Zhang, I was at the APEC meeting, including the APEC CEO summit. You did hear President Trump talking about bilateral only and criticizing other countries not opening the door to the American businesses. But at the same time, you also noticed that, you know, it is business as usual. No matter what the U.S. president said, the others just go ahead and do as they plan, you know. So it's kind of interesting, an atmosphere there. The question really is, in people's mind, not many dare to ask, but the ultimate question is, does the United States still going to matter in the region? Is it still really going to be as relevant as it used to be? If not, to what degree is not? And what would that mean to America when it comes to their trading capabilities, when it comes to their relations with China, particularly in the region? Mr. Zhang, Chinese perspective.
Even if Trump, insisting on those bilateral relationship, but I still believe that U.S. has, very important, influential, very important impact on the region, especially if you look at a diplomatic relationship, trade relationship, investment relationship between the U.S. and other countries in the region. I do believe that. But on the other hand, I'm afraid, personally, I think that Trump maybe has his own plan. For example, by bilateral free trade agreements, even if that will take time, but they will chase much more benefit for the U.S. On the other hand, for those, for example, TPP 11 countries, actually they still have their desire for the U.S. back on the track. So in this regard, actually, the U.S. still not, leaving TPP track fully.
Yeah.
So maybe after, several years, it would be very possible, the U.S. will be back on that track.
Mr. Mealy, you were smiling earlier, and there is a talk like that, saying, well, probably the United States, even with the president not necessarily being praised all over the world, but does pose a more flexible way of dealing its trade issues. It can join, it can withdraw, it can do whatever as long as it is in the biggest, the best, the interest of itself. What do you say? Is that possible?
What I think is the one thing we know about our system is that while oftentimes a political candidate during a campaign can make very large pronouncements, but once that candidate becomes sort of the head of state, the realities of our system, where you have a Congress that also has a very powerful role in our Constitution around matters of trade, also then becomes the reality. So I think that really, at the end of the day, it's going to be something in the middle. I know many of the policymakers in Asia are very much watching the processes around the NAFTA modernization effort, and also some of the bilateral conversations between the U.S. government and the government of Korea around the bilateral free trade agreement between those two countries. I think how those processes move forward will really send the clearer signal to partners in Asia as to the administration's approach towards international trade and economic engagement with the world.
And at this point, Mr. Zhang, all of this 12-day, busy 2 weeks, Asia-Pacific meeting time seem to have a possibility of wrapping up finally. This is the time when people think about the conclusions of these meetings and also possibly come up with action plans to translate those rhetorics into real actions. With your knowledge of the region, Mr. Zhang, what are the things that you think it's important to look at for us right now in order to see which direction is this region really going, Mr. Zhang?
Yeah, for ASEAN 10 economies, this year is very special because of their 50 years and 50 anniversaries. Also, ASEAN countries has a very ambitious, infrastructure connectivity plan. That is the master plan. Also, they hope that this plan can connect with China's BRI. In the future, I do believe that ASEAN will be the new manufacturing center in the world. And then their demand for both infrastructure improvement as well as their industrialization gradually will be booming. That means between China and ASEAN economies, there is a very huge potential to promote cooperation because China's supply capacity, for both infrastructure and industrialization, very strong. Also, if you look at China's Belt and Road Initiative, not only infrastructure but also people-to-people connectivity and trade investment promotion. So in this regard, I do believe that between China and ASEAN in the future, we will formulate the biggest market in the world.
Mr. Mealy, next year the ASEAN Summit is going to be hosted by Singapore. It is a long-time ally of the United States. And we all know during the time of the so-called rebalance in Asia by the previous administration, Singapore government was in probably, as they see it, in the right team, in the right line. What do you make of next year? We see ups and downs of the region. This year seemed to be quite peaceful. What are some of the things you would study, Mr. Mealy, given your knowledge of the region?
Sure. I think all of us here in terms of on the U.S. side look at ASEAN this year as a good year. Not great, but certainly not bad. I think ASEAN, under the chairmanship of the Philippines, has done a good job of sort of maintaining the notion of ASEAN centrality in the Asia-Pacific. Growth has been very, very positive, and we've seen good progress on some of the various economic elements of the creation of the ASEAN economic community. So I think going into next year, with Singapore taking over the chairmanship year of ASEAN, a couple of areas I think are quite ripe for tangible progress for ASEAN. First and foremost is Singapore has indicated that it really wants to emphasize during its chairmanship year further development around the digital economy and technology and innovation growth in ASEAN. I think that's an area that is certainly very appropriate for promoting development in ASEAN, whether you're a Laos or whether you're Malaysia. There are challenges, but there's also opportunities around technology. I think secondly, we're looking at really, again, further progress along the infrastructure connectivity agenda. And here again, I believe partners like China, partners like America, private capital will all play a very important role in helping ASEAN meet sort of its infrastructure financing needs next year and going forward. And then finally, I think ASEAN is also really going to have to continue to make progress around human capital development and vocational training. Because as we know, with rapid growth in many of the economies, there also can become issues of income inequality and development gaps between the more advanced economies and the less advanced economies.
That's true.
And I think that's another area where, again, ASEAN's partners, whether it be China, Japan, Korea, and America, can be very helpful for ASEAN under Singapore's chairmanship next year.
Right. Before we go, I do have a final question for both of you. We see over the past 1 year or two, different countries in the region, non-ASEAN members, trying to take a lead on initiatives related to ASEAN. Japan, for example, on the TPP, which is now called CPTPP, and then China on the Belt and Road Initiative. All of this has a lot to do with ASEAN. For the future, how are we going to see, whether you call it competition or cooperation of leadership in the region vis-a-vis its relationship with the ASEAN countries? Mr. Mealy, you want to go first?
Sure. I think, ASEAN at 50 is at an interesting moment. They can be proud of the kind of accomplishments that have been achieved so far. But I think looking ahead, there are going to be some opportunities to really deepen economic cooperation, coordination, and ultimately try to move forward towards deeper regional economic integration.
I see.
I think for ASEAN to really play the kind of role that it has played historically in the region, it's going to be a bit more important for the leaders of the 10 countries to perhaps be a bit more politically focused on the regional economic integration agenda itself, and also this notion of ASEAN centrality. I think that'll be very, very critical going forward. And then finally, I think, again, how well ASEAN really does try to really put in place the ASEAN economic community, where you really do have a single market and also a single production platform that is globally connected, are also going to be very paramount for ASEAN going forward, given the emergence of China and India.
All right.
Which obviously will continue to play out.
Okay, we are running out of time, and Mr. Zhang, maybe we'll have your views some other time. Thank you so much for both of you, Zhang Jianping and Marc Mealy. We would like to also express our appreciation for Mr. Lim Tai Wei from Singapore earlier. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program.